You've looked at a map of China and thought, big country, big population, that's the whole story. It's not. Population explains why China builds things. It doesn't explain why China was always going to be able to build them. Underneath the world's most populous country sits a set of resources so specific, so concentrated, that losing access to them would stop entire global industries within months. Smartphones, missiles, electric motors, wind turbines, solar panels. Almost all of it runs through land that China happens to control. So how did one country end up sitting on the ingredients for the next century of technology, decades before anyone knew that technology would exist? The answer starts in a stretch of desert most people have never heard of. The first place to look is Bayan Obo, in Inner Mongolia. On a map, it's a dot in the middle of nowhere. Dry grassland, low hills, nothing that looks unusual. But beneath that grassland sits the largest rare earth deposit ever discovered. Rare earths aren't actually rare, they're just rarely found in concentrations worth mining. Bayan Obo is the exception. It holds roughly 70% of the world's proven rare earth reserves in a single deposit. 17 elements with names most people can't pronounce. Neodymium, dysprosium, yttrium, and every one of them shows up somewhere in modern technology. Neodymium magnets are why your phone vibrates, and why a wind turbine can generate power at low speeds. Dysprosium is why an electric motor can run at high temperature without losing power. Remove these elements, and entire categories of modern manufacturing stop functioning. China doesn't just have the largest reserve, it processes about 85% of the world's refined rare earths, including material mined in other countries. Australia digs rare earth ore out of the ground. Most of it still gets shipped to China to be refined into something usable. The mine matters less than the mill, and China has both. But rare earths are only the first resource. The second is something far older and far simpler: coal. Shanxi Province, in northern China, sits on one of the largest coal reserves on Earth. For over 1,000 years, people in this region have pulled coal out of the ground by hand, in some of the same hillsides still being mined today. Shanxi alone produces more coal each year than the entire United States. That single province powers a significant share of Chinese steel production, which is itself roughly half of all steel made on the planet. Steel needs coking coal. Coking coal needs geology that took hundreds of millions of years to form. Shanxi has both, and that's the quiet reason China can outbuild almost anyone. Not because of ambition, but because the raw ingredient for steel was already sitting under one province. Drive through Shanxi today, and you'll still see the same thing you would have seen a century ago. Trucks loaded with coal, moving in an endless line toward the rest of the country. Then there's water, specifically where China's water comes from. The Tibetan plateau isn't just the highest region on Earth, it's the source of nearly every major river in Asia. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, the Indus. All of them begin in or near the same high-altitude ice fields. Geographers sometimes call it the third pole, because it holds more ice than anywhere outside the Arctic and Antarctic. Only 2 places on the planet store more frozen fresh water, and neither of them has a single person living downstream who depends on it for survival. This one does. Whoever controls that plateau controls the headwaters for roughly 1.8 billion people downstream, across China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and several other countries. That's close to 1/4 of the human race, drinking, farming, and building cities on water that started as snowfall inside one country's borders. Look at each river separately, and the pattern gets stranger. The Yellow River built the floodplain, where Chinese civilization itself began, thousands of years before anyone used the word China. The Mekong feeds rice paddies across Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Tens of millions of farmers who have never set foot in China, entirely dependent on a river that starts there. The Brahmaputra crosses into India and eventually Bangladesh. carrying the runoff that fills reservoirs neither country controls the source of. The Indus does the same for Pakistan. None of these countries can do anything about a dam built upstream, because upstream isn't their territory. It's the Tibetan plateau, and the Tibetan plateau is China's. China built the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze, the largest power station ever constructed by output, more electricity than the next several largest dams on Earth combined. But the dam isn't really the story. Dams can be built almost anywhere there's a river and the will to build one. The story is that the water arriving at that dam started falling as snow on a plateau that just happens to sit entirely inside China's borders. You can build a dam. You can't build a mountain range that catches monsoon moisture and holds it as ice for thousands of years. That part was already finished, long before there was an engineer alive to take advantage of it. Every river that feeds half a continent starts in the same few thousand square miles. One country happens to own all of it, and every dam it builds on its own side of that plateau is, technically, entirely legal, even when it changes how much water arrives in 5 other countries. One more region worth naming, Qinghai and the salt flats of western China, where some of the world's largest lithium brine deposits sit alongside rare earth-adjacent minerals used in battery production. It's a strange kind of geography. The same high, dry plateau system that feeds Asia's rivers also happens to sit above some of its most valuable battery minerals, as if the region got handed 2 completely unrelated forms of leverage at once. Combine that mineral wealth with China's refining dominance, and you get an uncomfortable fact for the rest of the world. Even a lithium mine in Australia, or a cobalt mine in the Congo, often ends up feeding a battery factory in China, because that's where the refining capacity was built first. Australia can dig the ore out of the ground faster than almost anyone. It still ships most of it overseas to be turned into something a car company can actually use. The raw mineral can come from almost anywhere. The factory that turns it into something usable almost always sits in the same country. Extraction is scattered across a dozen continents. Refining, for the resources that matter most right now, keeps ending up in one. There's a 5th resource worth mentioning, and it's not underground at all: graphite. Most people have never thought about graphite as strategic. It's the material inside a pencil. It's also the primary component of the anode in almost every lithium-ion battery on Earth. China produces roughly 2/3 of the world's natural graphite and processes an even larger share of the refined version used in batteries. A car company in Germany or a battery plant in the United States can source lithium from Chile and cobalt from the Congo, and still end up dependent on Chinese graphite to finish the battery. It's the ingredient nobody talks about, sitting quietly behind almost every electric vehicle built anywhere. Most of it comes from a single province, Heilongjiang, in China's far northeast, where flake graphite has been mined for decades without ever making headlines. No one photographs a graphite mine. No one puts it on a magazine cover. It just keeps shipping out, quarter after quarter, while the rest of the world argues about lithium. That quiet, unglamorous quality is exactly what makes graphite dangerous to ignore. When people picture resource power, they picture oil fields and gold mines, something visible, something dramatic. Graphite doesn't look like power. It looks like a schoolroom material. That's precisely why almost no country outside China bothered to build serious processing capacity for it. By the time electric vehicles turned graphite into a strategic material, China wasn't starting from zero. It already had the mines, the refineries, and decades of supply contracts in place. Everyone else was starting from scratch, in a market China had quietly owned the whole time. Rare earths, coal, water, battery minerals, graphite. 5 resources, 5 different regions, one country controlling the processing step for nearly all of them. Line them up and a pattern appears that has nothing to do with luck in any single case, and everything to do with luck repeated 5 times over. If resources alone made countries powerful, this wouldn't be unusual. Plenty of countries sit on valuable ground. The Democratic Republic of the Congo holds a large share of the world's cobalt, a mineral just as essential to batteries as anything in Qinghai. Nigeria has oil reserves most countries would envy. Neither country turned that into the kind of leverage China has. Economists call this pattern the resource curse. When a country's wealth sits in the ground, instead of in its institutions, industries, and infrastructure, the resource itself can end up creating dependency rather than power. Congolese cobalt mostly leaves the country as raw ore, processed somewhere else, sold back as a finished product, at a markup no one in the Congo sees. Nigerian oil built pipelines and export terminals, but never quite built the refineries needed to turn that oil into fuel for its own population. For years, Nigeria exported crude and imported gasoline, paying twice for the same resource. So why doesn't that describe China? Because China didn't stop at extraction. It built the refineries, the ports, the rail lines, and the factories that turn raw ore into finished product. And then it built the manufacturing base that turns finished product into everything from phones to solar panels. The Congo exports cobalt ore. China exports batteries. Nigeria exports crude oil. China exports the electric motor. The oil eventually becomes irrelevant too. That's the entire difference. And it's the difference between owning a resource and owning an industry. One sells the ingredient. The other sells the finished meal. And every step in between. There's a pattern hiding inside all 5 of these resources, and it's easy to miss. None of them were valuable a century ago. Rare earths were a scientific curiosity until magnets and electronics needed them. Lithium was a novelty metal until batteries needed it. Graphite was for pencils. Coal was already valuable, but not on the scale steel production would eventually demand. China didn't stake out this land because it predicted electric vehicles or wind turbines or smartphones. Nobody could have predicted that far ahead. The deposits were simply already there, sitting under provinces and plateaus that had been part of the same country for a very long time, waiting for the rest of the world to invent a reason to need them. Geology doesn't announce its own importance. It just waits, quietly, for technology to catch up. And there's a second, quieter pattern underneath the first one. Almost none of these resources sit in the parts of China most people picture when they think of the country. Not Shanghai, not Beijing, not the coastline packed with factories and container ships. Inner Mongolia, Shanxi, Qinghai, the Tibetan plateau, Heilongjiang. These are the edges, the interior, the places that rarely appear in footage of Chinese cities. The wealth that will matter most in the next 50 years isn't sitting in the skyscrapers. It's sitting underneath provinces most people outside China couldn't find on a map. Go back to that map of China. At first glance, it looks like the story is population. Over 1 billion people, endless factories, sheer scale. That's not where the story starts. It starts underground. In a desert in Inner Mongolia, in the coal seams of Shanxi, in the ice fields of a plateau most people can't place on a map, in salt flats and graphite mines most people have never heard of. China didn't know, 100 years ago, that rare earths would power electric motors, or that lithium would matter more than gold. Nobody did. The deposits were already there, waiting for the technology to catch up to the geology. China isn't sitting on the most important land of the next century because it planned it that way from the start. It's sitting on it because, this time, the ground underneath happened to match the century that came after it. If you want to see how the same idea plays out somewhere nobody expects, I made a video about a country whose buried resources are about to matter far more than anyone realizes. I'll link it here. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.